1. I think we just went through that not that long ago as we were going through the book of Psalms and some other stuff, right? The Lord looked down and there were none that did good. No, not one. But I also love the mercy that's shown in that song, because the song talks about those that are, it doesn't use these words, but it's dealing with the idea that those that are repentant and that come to the Lord, right? Those that turn to the Lord, He won't turn away. Thankful to know the Lord Jesus Christ saves sinners, right? Because if He didn't, there'd be no hope for me. Thankful to know that He saves sinners. All right, we are actually going to continue what we started this morning in Acts chapter 7. I know in the afternoon I've been going through the book of Psalms, and we will get back there. There's a couple things leading to this. I'm trying to pray about and decide what to do about Psalms chapter 16. We technically already went through Psalms 16 not that long ago as we were going through quotes in the Old Testament, because that happens to be the chapter that talks about not leaving His Holy One to see corruption. So I'm trying to decide, do we go back through it beginning to end, or do we go ahead and go on to chapter 17? And the other thing was, as I look at Acts chapter 7, it dawned on me that to go through Acts chapter 7 with the detail that I intend on going through, it's going to take several messages. And so instead of them all being a full week apart from each other, I'm going to go ahead and keep going on that tonight and see if we can make some progress. Hopefully, when we went through this morning's message, which was really kind of what was happening leading up to chapter 7, right? Remember, Stephen is on trial. They're accusing him of blasphemy and other things, but the main accusations are that he wants to do away with the law and with the temple, and that Jesus is going to come and destroy the temple. Some other things there that are kind of being said. And Acts chapter 7, we went through it really pretty quickly. We read the whole thing, right? It's dealing with starting with Abraham, how Stephen shows that he knows all of the law, and he knows the history, and he knows the promise to Abraham, and the promises to Moses, and the promises to David. He knows what the tabernacle was supposed to be a witness of. He understands the temple, but he also understands that God doesn't dwell in things made with hands, right? And he ended, of course, with some direct comments to them about how, just like their fathers who were stiff-necked and hard-hearted, they have been the same way, and how the fathers had killed and hurt the prophets, and that they have slain the just one, the Holy One. Of course, they know exactly who he's talking about. They know that he's talking about the Lord Jesus Christ there, of course. And they react to that by biting on him and gnashing on him with their teeth. And then as he cries out and declares that Jesus Christ is standing at the right hand of God, they lose all semblance of sanity almost. And they literally drag him through the city, cast him out of the city, and stone him. And in his final moments, he, of course, pleads for mercy for them, right? Just like Jesus Christ called out for mercy for those that were crucifying him. And again, we talked about the fact that it's really neat because Saul is witness to this and part of this, and would have been one of the ones that Stephen's prayer was directed toward. And yet I don't know about the rest of them, but I know the Lord forgave Saul, redeemed him, and used him mightily. Saul went on to preach some of the same things that Stephen did, and it never left Paul. I really think that when you get down to the end of Paul's ministry and he starts to talk about some of the things that he's done and been and who he is, he refers back to I don't think he ever forgot what he saw here. Okay? And so that's the context of what we're talking about. Stephen is preaching to them while defending himself in regards to this. And again, I think he's doing a few things. He's showing that he knows the Old Testament. He's showing, I understand the Scriptures, right? But then he's also drawing parallels to them, and he wants them to see the hard-heartedness of those that don't turn to God. He wants them to see what the promise to Abraham was really all about, and what the prophecy of Moses was really all about, and what the whole tabernacle and the temple and all those things, what those things were all about. Because really, when it boiled down to it, they understood, maybe understood is the wrong word, they knew all these things that Stephen said, but they were missing the point of all of those things. And so we want to see exactly how Stephen handles this. I will tell you there's going to be a lot of reading as we go through some of these. You might as well just take your Bible and turn to Genesis. You can start in chapter 13, I think is the... Genesis chapter 12 will be the first place we are. And you might as well just like take a bookmark or your finger or something and keep it between Acts and Genesis, because we're going to be kind of going back and forth. I had actually written up a nice little cheat sheet that would show all of these references, and I walked off this morning without actually printing said references and bringing them. I'll try to bring them next week, because we won't be done by the end of today. All right, so we understand in verse 2, when Stephen starts to answer, he says, "Men and brethren and fathers, hearken, the God of glory appeared unto our father Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia, before he dwelt in Charan. And he said unto him, Get thee out of the country, of thy country, and from thy kindred, and come unto the land which I will show thee. Then he came out of the land of the Chaldeans, and dwelt in Charan, and from thence, when his father was dead, he removed him unto this land, wherein ye now dwell." So this is how he starts. He says, "Is this thing so? Did you really say that Jesus is going to come and destroy the temple? Did you really say that we should abandon the things of Moses? Did you really say that we should forsake the law of God? Did you really say these things?" And he says, "Listen, men and brethren, I know that God spoke to Abraham when Abraham wasn't even in the promised land, before Abraham was even there. Matter of fact, Stephen doesn't say this, but if you really look at it, it's likely that Abraham was living in the midst of a paganistic area, right? And he was supposed to forsake all of that and forsake his family and everything, and go away from that stuff, and by faith go where God sent him. And by the way, this insinuates some of this. Go even before God told him where he was going. Will you go even when God doesn't tell you exactly where you're going to end up, right? He says, I know that this is what happened, and that God appeared unto him while he was in Mesopotamia. That is actually, if you want to turn over to Genesis chapter 12. It's interesting when you look at this stuff. If you back up to chapter 11, this is going through the descendants of Noah. Really, it talks about, the first part talks about the Tower of Babel. It talks about Shem's descendants. And then in verse 27 of chapter 11, this is going through a guy by the name of Terah. It says, "Now these are the generations of Terah. Terah begot Abraham and Nahor and Haran begot Lot. And Haran died before his father Terah in the land of his nativity in the Ur of the Chaldees. And Abraham and Nahor took them wives. The name of Abraham's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife Milcah, and the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah, and the father of Iscah. But Sarai was barren, and she had no child." Verse 30 is important as we get later into this. But Sarah, or later to be called Sarah, was barren. She didn't have any kids. In verse 31, "And Terah took Abram, his son, and Lot, the son of Haran, his son's son, and Sarai, his daughter-in-law, his son Abraham's wife. And they went forth with them from Ur of the Chaldees to go into the land of Canaan. And they came unto Haran and dwelt there. And the days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. Now, when you jump over to chapter 12, verse 1, it says, Now the Lord had said unto Abraham, Get thee out of thy country and from thy kindred and from thy father's house unto a land that I will show thee. Now that's basically what Stephen is quoting in chapter 7, verse 3. Get thee out of thy country and from thy kindred and come unto the land which I will show thee. It is so interesting when you read this, the debate about whether Stephen's account is accurate or not. Because in Stephen's account, he talks about how that the Lord came unto Abraham while he was still in Mesopotamia. In other words, while he was still in the Ur of the Chaldees, before he had went on somewhere else. But then people will come over to chapter 11, verse 12, and say, well, if you look in chapter 11, while his dad was still alive, him and others left Ur of the Chaldees, and they went over to this other place. And then in chapter 12, it says, God talked to Abraham. And so Stephen must have been wrong because he said all that happened beforehand. Well, there's two things. I mean, it's easily explainable. One, maybe God said it twice. Could be. I don't even think you have to say that. Because when you read chapter 12, pay really close attention to the words. Now the Lord had said unto Abraham, or unto Abram, Get thee out of thy country. The indication, just because this verse happens to fall at the end of his father's death, while they had already left Ur of Chaldees, does not mean this message came before he left Ur of the Chaldees. Matter of fact, it uses the word had said unto him versus, pay attention, because lots of times when you look at this stuff, this is the way it'll be. And the Lord said unto. It doesn't say that. It said, had said unto Abram. There is no conflict here. There is no, well, the New Testament got it wrong, or Stephen got it wrong, or there's well, you can't trust the Bible because it's got unresolved conflict. They are both correct. There is no conflict here. You need to pay close attention to the words. So, he says, I know that God spoke to Abraham. I am not saying, Stephen is almost saying here, listen, brethren, I fully understand who Abraham is. And I know that he had direct revelation from God. I know God spoke to him. And I know God called him out of where he was. And I know God sent him to the land that we now dwell in. I'm not calling into question Abraham. I'm not calling into question God's calling of Abraham. I'm not calling into question God's special place for Abraham's seed. I know who Abraham is, and I know that he's called of God. And I know that where God sent him was in the land that we now dwell in. Okay? Stephen's good with all that. Verse 5. And he gave him none inheritance in it, no, not so much as to set his foot on. Yet he promised that he would give it to him for a possession, and to his seed after him, when as yet he had no child. Now, what did I say a little bit ago? Sarai, his wife, was barren. She had no child. And yet God called him out, told him to go. Okay, fine. But then as the story progresses, not only did he call him out, not only did he tell him to go, but he started to talk about how that he would make of him a great nation, and how that through his seed all nations would be blessed. But Abraham doesn't have any kids. Abraham has no children. And so how is this going to be? And so there's several different places here, and I'm only going to read a few of them. Back in Genesis chapter 12, verse 7, And the Lord appeared unto Abram and said, Unto thy seed will I give this land. And there builded he an altar unto the Lord, who appeared unto him. You start to see right away in chapter 12 that as Abraham followed the Lord, and as he went away and was going, and the Lord told him, this land that I'm sending you to, I will bless you, and I will give this land unto you and unto your seed, which is basically what you see in verse 5 of chapter 7. And he gave him none inheritance in it, no, not so much as to set his foot on, yet he promised that he would give it to him for a possession and to his seed after him, when as yet he had no child. Now, I'm going to get ahead of myself here a little bit. Understand that in many ways Abraham was a wanderer. Did he go to this promised land? He did. But even as things started happening and his wife died and other things like this, right? He still didn't possess the land, so to speak. He actually had to go buy a parcel of land to even be able to bury his family members and things like that. And you see here where Abraham was a man who lived greatly by faith, because so many of the things the Lord had said to Abraham were things that would happen long after Abraham's death. Abraham saw some pretty miraculous things. When Isaac was born, that was something that could not be explained, right? That him and his wife, they were really past the point of bearing children, and yet they had a son. So Abraham saw some mighty things. Abraham saw God deliver him. But listen, Abraham was never in his life going to see his people possess the land. Matter of fact, we'll get into it in a minute, he's even told, by the way, before it even gets that way, they're going to have to leave. And they're going to be in bondage like 400 years. And then I'll bring them back. You see what I'm saying? Stephen knew that Abraham had got a direct revelation from God. He knew he was called by God. And he's also pointing out how that Abraham, by faith, went where God sent him and believed what God said, even though he couldn't see it. He so much as didn't have a place to put his foot, really, that he could call his own. And yet this is his. This is his land to be given to his seed after him. But then, as you continue, and go ahead and turn over to chapter 13 of Genesis. I'll read this verse too. It says in verse 14 of chapter 13, "And the Lord said unto Abram, after that Lot was separated from him, lift up thine eyes and look from the place where thou art northward and southward and eastward and westward. For all the land which thou seest, to thee will I give it, and to thy seed forever. And I will make thy seed as the dust of the earth, so that if a man can number the dust of the earth, then shall thy seed also be numbered. Arise, walk through the land, and the length of it and the breadth of it, for I will give it unto thee." Then Abram removed his tent and came and dwelt in the plain of Mamre, which is in Hebron, and dwelt there and built there an altar unto the Lord. You see this? Abram sees and knows and believes that God is going to do what God said he would do. He worships God. He doesn't have it yet, but he worships God. And Stephen is alluding to those things. Verse 6 of Acts. And there's a lot of stuff that we could read here that we're not going to just for time's sake. There's some stuff that happens in chapter 14 with Abraham. Abram having to rescue Lot. We see Abraham being blessed by Melchizedek. And then in chapter 15 we start to see about God's covenant with Abram. And this is the next place that Stephen goes after talking about Abram having been called and having went. Even before he possessed anything, he went. He knew God's promise. And then we start to see a promise about the covenant. It says in verse 6, "And God spake on this wise, that his seed should sojourn in a strange land, and that they should bring them into bondage and entreat them evil 400 years. And the nation to whom they shall be in bondage will I judge, said God, and after that shall they come forth and serve me in this place. You understand how far out God is talking to Abraham about? By the way, the context and the reason I'm talking about the covenant is because at the point in time where Abraham hears this whole thing about, listen, your seed is going to have to leave the land and they're going to go somewhere else and they're going to sojourn and then they're going to be in bondage and they're going to be mistreated. But then when it's time, I'm going to bring them back. Why am I talking about the covenant and that part of the story? Because that part of the story is told to Abraham as God is revealing his plan and his covenant and making his covenant with Abraham. Matter of fact, if you look at the top of chapter 15 of Genesis, it says, after these things the word of the Lord came unto Abram in a vision, saying, Fear not, Abram, I am thy shield and thy exceeding great reward. And Abram said, Lord God, what wilt thou give me, seeing I go childless? At this point, Abraham still has no children, but yet God has said he's going to have this great nation come from him. And he says, and the steward of my house is Eleazar of Damascus. And Abram said, Behold, to me thou hast given no seed, and lo, one born in my house is mine heir. And behold, the word of the Lord came unto him, saying, This shall not be thine heir, but he that shall come forth out of thine own bowels shall be thine heir. And he brought him forth abroad, and said, Look now toward heaven, and tell the stars, if thou be able to number them. And he said unto them, So shall thy seed be. And he believed in the Lord, and he counted it to him for righteousness. And he said unto him, I am the Lord that brought thee out of the Ur of the Chaldees to give thee this land to inherit it. And he said, Lord God, whereby shall I know that I shall inherit it? And he said unto him, Take me an heifer of 3 years old, and a she-goat of 3 years old, and a ram of 3 years old, and a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. And listen, for time's sake, we're not going to go through all this. I just want you to understand the context of where this conversation comes from. Abraham is apparently beginning to doubt or to fear, and the Lord comes to him in the night in a vision and says, You don't have any need to fear. And Abram says, But wait a minute, you've promised me all this stuff, and I don't even have any kids, and how is this even going to be possible? And maybe it's because there's going to be some servant in my house. And the Lord says, Whoa. That's not my plan. You go out and you look at the stars of heaven, and you can't number them. That's going to be your people. I promise you, of your own body, not a servant, not somebody that inherits because you have no kids, of your own body, I will make an untold number of people. And Abram says, That's great. And he believed God, and it was counted to him for righteousness. And then he says, What's the sign that you're going to do this? And the Lord actually lays out for him here this whole thing he goes through that's going to be a showing of his covenant and his sign with Abraham. Now, for our benefit, we're going to come down to verse 12. And when the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram, and lo, an horror of great darkness fell upon him. And he said unto Abram, Know of a surety that thy seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them 400 years. And also that nation whom they shall serve will I judge, and afterward shall they come out with great substance. And thou shalt go to thy fathers in peace. Thou shalt be buried in a good old age. But in the 4th generation they shall come hither again, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. And it come to pass that when the sun went down, it was dark, behold, a smoking furnace and a burning lamp that passed between those pieces. Now, what I hadn't read to you is God had started to lay out all these things Abram was supposed to do, and he was supposed to lay it out a certain way. And then Abraham got put in a sleep, and in this sleep he had this, the Lord spoke to him and said, Hey, this is what's going to happen to the seed. I promised you a seed's coming. It is coming. This is what's going to happen. They're going to get out. They're going to get persecuted. And I'm going to bring them back when the time is right. And then the Lord fulfilled the rest of this covenant that he had, the thing that he had laid out for Abram to do. And he goes on and he talks about in verse 19, in the same day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, unto thy seed have I given this land, from the river Egypt unto the great river, the river Euphrates, and the Kenites, and the Kenizzites, and the Kadmonites, and the Hittites, and the Perizzites, and the Remphams, and the Amorites, and the Canaanites, and the Girgasites, and the Jebusites. Listen, all this stuff and all these people that you've been sojourning among, there's coming a day when all of this will be your children's possession. And he made a covenant with him. Stephen is referring back to this, and he's saying, listen, I understand. Not only did God call Abraham out of Ur of the Chaldees, and Abraham went. Not only did God promise that he would make of him a great nation, but God promised and foretold that we would go into bondage. Now what's he starting to build up to? Well, he's talked about who Abraham is and that he understands where that comes from. He understands the idea of following God in faith. He understands the promise to Abraham's seed. And now he's starting to build into how God's going to fulfill that covenant. And he's going to start to transition over to a guy by the name of Moses. He's tracing this down. He really, in a lot of ways, starting in Genesis chapter 12, he preaches through almost the rest of Genesis and a big chunk of Exodus. So what exactly? Listen, when he said that they were going to be over there 400 years and they were going to be in bondage and then when the time was right, he was going to send them out. He's talking about when they went into the land of Egypt. And we'll get there here in a little bit. Man, there's just so much here. This is why I know that this is going to take more than one or two messages here. Verse 8. And he gave him the covenant of circumcision. And so Abraham begat Isaac and circumcised him the 8th day. And Isaac begat Jacob, and Jacob begat the 12 patriarchs. And the patriarchs, moved with envy, sold Joseph into Egypt. But God was with him. I love this story, by the way, of Joseph. And I'm going to get ahead of myself for a second. There is a chapter in Psalms that talks about how that God sent Joseph ahead. In other words, it was all part of the plan. It was a plan 400 years. When Moses left Egypt, listen, God had already said all that stuff was going to happen. God had already said they were going to go into Egypt. God had already said that they were going to then be delivered. But not only that, listen, them even being in Egypt, God was moving and arranging things and positioning things and laying it out just so it would be exactly what he wanted. Now, before we get there, though, we got to tackle this covenant of circumcision. In verse 8, and he gave the covenant of circumcision, and so Abraham begot Isaac and circumcised him the 8th day. Stephen is on trial for basically, people are saying he's trying to destroy the law. He's trying to do away with the things that were given to Moses. He's trying to get rid of the stuff that was passed down through Abraham and everybody else. And Stephen is saying, look, I know all about that stuff. I know why we do circumcision. I know why circumcision is there. I know when and why that promise came. And what he's referring to, by the way, there's a couple different places. We're going to jump to Genesis chapter 17. As we start to get into, now Abram is Abraham, or soon to be here, and we're going to see the covenant of circumcision given in chapter 17. Let's just start in verse 1. And when Abram was 90 years old and 9, the Lord appeared to Abram and said unto him, I am the Almighty God. Walk before me and be thou perfect. And I will make my covenant between me and thee, and will multiply thee exceedingly. And Abram fell on his face, and God talked with him, saying, As for me, behold, my covenant is with thee, and thou shalt be a father of many nations. Neither shall thy name any more be called Abram, but thy name shall be called Abraham, for a father of many nations have I made thee. And I will make thee exceeding fruitful, and will make nations of thee, and the king shall come, and kings shall come out of thee. I'm going to pause here for just a second. How many times now has God said this to Abraham? Leave, and I'm going to make of you a great nation. I know you don't have any children, but look up at the stars. I'm going to make of you a great nation. No, it doesn't have to be through your servant. It doesn't have to be through Ishmael. It doesn't have to be through this. It doesn't have to be through that. I am going to make of you a great nation. And now chapter 17, you might say it almost seems like he's a broken record, because he's coming back and he's telling him again, Abram, man, you've got my covenant, and I'm going to be with you, and I'm going to give you this, and I'm going to give you that, and you're going to have great nations come out of you. Abraham truly had to have been a man of faith, because we are talking about multiple years that have went by, and still no kids, still no major possession in the land. But yet God's message is not changed. Abram, I'm with you. You have my covenant. You're going to be my people. And I'm going to make of you a great nation. In verse 7, And I will establish my covenant between me and thee, and thy seed after thee and their generations, for an everlasting covenant, to be a God unto them and to thy seed after thee. Verse 8, And I will give unto thee and to thy seed after thee the land wherein thou art a stranger, all the land of Canaan, for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. And God said unto Abraham, Thou shalt keep my covenant, therefore, thou and thy seed after thee and their generations. Now the Lord is building up to something, because something else is about to happen. The promises that the Lord has been given are about to start to come to pass. And he's got something that he wants Abraham to do. He says, listen, I've told you this is what's going to happen. I've told you you're going to possess the land. I've told you that great nations are going to come out of you. But I've got something that I want you to do as a sign of the covenant between us. How many of you ever thought, and hopefully maybe you didn't, but how many of you ever thought that, in the Old Testament, circumcision was a requirement to be saved, or to be, be able to go to heaven, or to be, with God? Listen, I'm not downplaying the importance of it, but I am telling you that circumcision was an outward sign of the covenant that God had made with Israel. I hesitate to say nothing more and nothing less, because listen, that's a powerful thing. But the Lord even, in other places you understand that it wasn't that outward thing that did it. The Lord has even said, man, you are uncircumcised in heart. Your heart has no covenant with me. It is a matter of the heart, but this is an outward sign. This is an outward sign of the covenant between God and his people. And he tells him in verse 9 that he should follow this covenant and keep it. In verse 10, This is my covenant which ye shall keep between me and you and thy seed after thee. Every man-child among you shall be circumcised, and ye shall circumcise the flesh of your foreskin, and it shall be a token of the covenant betwixt me and thee. A token of the covenant betwixt me and you. In verse 12, And he that is 8 days old shall be circumcised among you, every man-child in your generations. He that is born in the house or bought with money of any stranger, which is not of thy seed. He that is born in thy house and he that is bought with thy money must needs be circumcised, and my covenant shall be in your flesh for an everlasting covenant. And the uncircumcised man-child, whose flesh of his foreskin is not circumcised, that soul shall be cut off from his people, and he hath broken my covenant. Now, God lays out this sign. This is supposed to be the symbol of the covenant that I have made with you and that you have made with me, right? Abraham don't even have that child yet. But God's already laying out like, okay, this is what I want you to do. And man, when all these kids are born in generation after generation after generation, man, I want each one of them to follow this thing. With 8 days, they're going to be circumcised. And it's supposed to be a reminder of this covenant between us. How many of you sitting here would be going, that's great. Ain't got no kid. What are you talking about? But man, God's just laying it out. Here you go. We see in the last part of chapter 17, Isaac's birth is promised. And God said unto Abraham, as for Sarai thy wife, thou shalt not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall her name be. And I will bless her and give thee a son also of her. Yea, I will bless her, and she shall be a mother of nations. Kings of people shall be of her. Man, you see all this promise that's coming and how the Lord is promised. And Abraham, by this point, has Ishmael. And he even says when God tells him a child's coming from Sarai, he's already tried the servant path. Well, now he's trying Ishmael, which is, by the way, his son through one of his wife's handmaidens. And God says, no, listen, you're not listening, Abraham. You're not listening. It will be through your wife Sarah. And verse 21, but my covenant will I establish with Isaac, which Sarah shall bear unto thee at the set time in the next year. Right? So you see this promise that's referred to, but we've been given this command of circumcision. Jump over, if you would, a couple chapters to chapter 21. Chapter 21, verse 1, and the Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord said unto Sarah as he had spoken, and did unto Sarah as he had spoken. For Sarah conceived and bare Abraham a son in his old age, at the set time of which God had spoken to him. And Abraham called the name of his son that was born unto him, whom Sarah bore to him, Isaac. And Abraham circumcised his son Isaac, being 8 days old, as God had commanded him. You see back there in chapter 17, a promise of a child that would come through Sarah. And God, even back then, even before Sarah was expecting, said, when she has a child, this is the sign I want you to have between me and you. And I want you to teach your kids' kids and your kids' kids and their kids and their kids and their kids. This is the sign. The circumcision is what you're going to do. All the way over in chapter 21, with all the stuff that happened in between, what did Abraham do when Isaac was born? Well, he waited until Isaac was about 15 days old, and he went and had him circumcised. No. Had him circumcised day one. No. Well, he didn't even have him circumcised because that's cruel and unusual punishment, and why do that? No. 8 days, and he had him circumcised, which was exactly what the Lord had commanded him before. A sign of the covenant between them. Now, to the story so far, you've got Abraham being called, going by faith, promise of a future seed, a promise that great nations would come of him, a covenant that's made with Abraham, another covenant and a sign of that covenant. And now we start to get into Isaac and Jacob and the patriarchs, so to speak, as they call them. The patriarchs being the 12 sons of Jacob. And we're going to see here the last half of verse 8. And Isaac begat Jacob, and Jacob begat the 12 patriarchs, and the patriarchs moved with envy, sold Joseph into Egypt, but God was with him. Now this here, and we're not going to read this whole story. I think probably every person in this room knows this story, but in Genesis 39, we won't read all of this. Actually, we should back up a little bit. You got to back up to verse 37, really. Joseph dreams dreams. Okay, even the youngest in here knows the coat of many colors and all that stuff, right? If you study Jacob's family, there's a lot of good things about Jacob and a lot of good things about a couple of his sons. But listen, there's a lot of drama in Jacob's family. We know the story about Joseph and his coat of many colors, and we know that his brothers had envy over that. We know that Joseph had dreams, and he talks about how that in his dreams his brothers were going to bow down to him. And oh man, talk about stroking the fire. Nothing like taking somebody that's already a little jealous of you and telling them how you're gonna be their boss someday, and just, it's an interesting family life early in the years here for Joseph. But you can absolutely, as you read that story, Acts is right, man. Those guys were envious of him. And we see where there's a time where down in Genesis chapter 37, verse 12, and his brethren went to feed their father's flock in Shechem, and Israel said unto Joseph, do not thy brethren feed the flock in Shechem? Come, and I will send thee unto them. And he said to him, Here am I. And he said to him, Go, I pray thee, see whether it will be well with thy brethren and well with the flocks, and bring me word again. So he went out of the vale of Hebron and came to Shechem. Now, what you'll find as you go, he's been sent to do this, but as you get a little bit further, you look in verse 18, and when they saw him afar off, even before he came near to them, they conspired against him to slay him. Man, how'd you like to have these brothers? The envy is so bad with them, they're literally talking about, how can we have him killed? How can we have him killed? They said in verse 19, they said one to another, Behold, this dreamer cometh. Come now, therefore, let us slay him and cast him into some pit. Now we know after the story, Reuben talks them out of that, convinces them to not do that. They do cast him into a pit. Reuben has every intention of coming back later and getting him out of this pit. But what happens? While Reuben's gone, and a couple of guys are sitting there at the pit, these people come traveling, I don't know what you want to call them, but they're on the market trail. They're heading from city to city to sell their wares, including people. And they get this idea, hey, we can make some money off of this and still be rid of him. And so they sell him to these traders who are going into Egypt. And you see here that they sell him, and he ends up in Egypt, right? Now we're going to have to stop here in just a second for time's sake, but I want you to know that in verse 9 of Acts, where it says, And the patriarchs, moved with envy, sold Joseph into Egypt, but God was with him. That is a critical statement. But God was with him. It can't seem to get much worse for Joseph. And I think you guys remember the story, so we'll give a sneak peek, right? What happens to Joseph when he gets to Egypt? I'm going to just drop it there for a second and let the kids think about that. What happens to Joseph when he gets to Egypt? Well, he gets sold into this house, and he actually does really well, and the guy that owns him really likes him, and he starts to put him in charge of everything he has. Hey, listen, it's bad, but it's starting to look up. But then this guy's wife makes some false accusations against him, and he gets thrown into prison. Well, man, things are looking pretty bad again. But you know what happens because he's in prison? Well, he interprets a few guys' dreams, and exactly what he interprets happens. Well, one of those guys whose dreams he happens to interpret happens to work for Pharaoh. Well, Pharaoh happens to have some bad dreams and he needs somebody to interpret his dream because he just can't get past it. Well, there happens to be somebody there that knows a guy who can interpret dreams. And he gets brought out of prison and he interprets the dream for Pharaoh. And now Pharaoh makes him governor. Basically, by the end of it, he is in second place throughout all of the land. That statement, but God was with him. Listen, God took Joseph through some pretty dark places, but he had a plan for Joseph. And Joseph remained faithful, and through Joseph, God got this family up to what he had told Abraham so long ago. Before Isaac was ever born, before circumcision had ever been given, before there was a great nation, before there was so many things, God told Abraham in that first covenant he made with him, this is what's going to happen, but it is of me. And I'm going to use somebody. And he used Joseph. Listen, you may be going through some ups and downs, and things may look good, and suddenly they look bad. And from the bad, you're in a position where now you can do something. And then that turns bad. But through that, you're in a position that you can do something. You know, you might step back from that and stop thinking about, man, if I could just get a good, clean, straight shot of nice, easy, everything's going my way, it'd be great. Well, maybe you need to step back and think, I don't know what God has planned for me, but He's obviously working in my life, and He's preparing me for something. Because that's exactly what He did with Joseph. Man, you can, when you step through each story, listen, if I take the story about Potiphar's wife by itself, man, that is a sad story. If I take him being cast in a pit and sold to slave traders, and I just read that part of the story, man, that is a sad story. If I read the part about how he was in prison and the guy that got let go was supposed to remind somebody of what he had done and he forgot and Joseph had to stay in prison, man, that is a sad story. But you stick all of it together and you look at where it led Joseph and you get a different picture. Some of what Stephen is saying here is, listen, I understand that God is with His people. God has made a covenant, and God will be faithful to that covenant. But there's more to that covenant than you guys realize. And He's going to build up to this one that Moses talked about, this prophet that would come. And then He's going to tell them, listen, you killed him. And He's trying to get them to see their need. And He's trying to get them to see their condition before God. Oh man, there's just so much here. And I'm trying to balance between giving enough of it to really drive home what Stephen is saying and giving so much of it that we lose sight of what Stephen is saying. So pray for me as we go through this. These are common stories. Listen, those of you that were born and raised in church, there's probably not a story I'm going to read in the course of covering chapter 7 that you didn't cover in Sunday school lesson somewhere. Don't downplay the importance of those lessons. Before you relegate these stories to, well, those are great Sunday school stories. Stephen gives his life recounting these stories as he's building up to saying all of that stuff was about Jesus Christ. All of that stuff was about the one that you just had murdered. Sometimes I think when we think about what to cover, what to study, what to look at. We look at some of these stories and go, oh yeah, but those are just Sunday school. Those are just Sunday school stories. Stephen gives his life telling those stories. They're not just relegated to Sunday school class. Man, those are shines and foreshadows of what was to come, which is all fulfilled in the life and the death and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. All right, with that, we're going to turn the services over to Brother Philip as he comes and leads us in a song. And appreciate your patience as we try to go through one chapter. It's going to take us a little while, but I think it'll be a blessing. All right, let's go ahead and stand as we sing.